This direct link was, if not entirely lost, somewhat less common through the next decades of role playing design. It was, for the most part, and very, very commonly, replaced by the champions method, which is derived actually from the fantasy trip, and which was picked up almost verbatim by GURPS. And those formed this immense, immense foundation for so many games. And everybody will recognize what I'm about to describe, which is at the far end of what I just described, far end from what I just described, which is that you have characters that are built effectively on generic points. You have a bunch of points. Some of them are compartmentalized depending on the game. This many points for skills, this many points for attributes, or something. Or you just get this wad of points and you put them all where you want to. But the idea is that the character is understandable in terms of this somewhat abstract, very abstract currency. And so at the end of a session or at the end of an adventure or what have you, you get a little handful of points. Here you go. Here. Your character was built on 150 points. Well, okay, here's 4. Now you're 154 points. Where are you going to put them? Typically in a game of this kind, that's on you. You know, scoop myself up a bit. One of the interesting points about this is that customizable, voluntary, not directly connected to what just happened in play quality actually makes a certain amount of sense in that the number of points you get at that particular moment aren't that big. So kind of a little tuning, if you're the kind of person who uses those points every time you get them, you get this very nice kind of shaving, tuning, slight addition, kind of cleaning out the lines of the character, and shifting a little priority here and there, or deciding that this skill is more important to you than those skills by like a point of effectiveness or something. But it has an incremental thing for people who let them build up because they forget about it. That sometimes leads to what the champions people called the radiation accident, where you suddenly find yourself with practically a whole new character worth of points that you just hadn't been paying attention to, and you look at your sheet and you're like, why don't I do a makeover? Right? Why don't we blow out the the jams, kick out the jams here, and like the character is going to get all transformed. You don't have to, but that's something that people sometimes found themselves doing and enjoying. But the point is, again, nothing about those points, once they're on a sheet, not used yet, nothing about them is earmarked for anything. So that's at the far end of what we just described. Keep that in mind as we read the rest of this question. I'm really not against players being free to roll on anything they want, but it does sort of feel like a wasted opportunity for progressions and improvement to feel like a consequence of play. Well, let's be a little critical here and don't say, I'm not really against X, but X kind of sucks and I want Y instead. And you're like, well, come on, man, you're against X. Just admit that, okay? What Lorenzo is saying, as I read it, is that in Mithras, when this is correct, by the way, in Mithras, you do get a similar roll to improve a skill as you do in Basic RuneQuest. So it's like that, but unlike Basic RuneQuest, it's more like those other games in that you're picking whatever skill you want to bring up, and you just pick the one you want of the ones on your sheet. And so what this means, just like it does for the sort of generic point construction thing, is that it's up to the player to say, what are we going to see in this character next? How is this character going to be changed on paper next? It's up to me to say, oh, look, there was a lot of detective work being used. Not only would I like to be better at it, but it kind of will accentuate and keep the momentum of having done all that detective work if I use these points to bump up detective work by, a roll unit. Which is just as directly consequential of play as the more mandated version. It's just that it was the player's choice to do it that way. Or another thing that players do with points of this kind is simply to say, you know, when I built the character, I didn't have enough points to make them as strong as I wanted them to be, and now I do. So the character is now as strong as I wanted them to be from the start. And in a lot of fiction, characters do this all the time. They get sort of shaped through how they're written now, and it's presumed that this is kind of what they always were, even if we didn't really see that happen before. Um, and that's perfectly fine and very doable with that kind of system. Um, or simply say, well, you know, I like this skill, and you know, next I haven't used it very much, but the next time I use it, I wouldn't mind if it was a little bit better than I see it on the sheet. No connection to the fiction whatsoever, past or present. I just feel like this could be a higher number because I like it now that I think about it. So I'm going to boost that. What I'd like to focus on is the notion that somehow that player free choice across the sheet thing diminishes a sense of connection to the fiction. These are all viable techniques. They're all okay. You can see Mithras is kind of splitting the difference, right? Because you still have the roll to improve rather than just here, have some points. But that's not really that big a deal. The big difference is that Mithras is more like those other games where you choose what you want it to go up or potentially go up. Whereas in RuneQuest and many other games, and more notably in recent history, Burning Wheel, it's really tied. I mean, tied specifically to this thing that you used and whether you succeeded or failed. We have seen dozens of variations on that through history. Some say that you get a roll to improve if you fail rather than if you succeed. Anyway, blah, blah, blah. Tons of variations. And Lorenzo's kind of saying, I like that. If you like that, then do that. Mithras won't break if you know, I mean, it won't break if you impose that from classic RuneQuest. I mean, it's not like those games aren't kissing cousins anyway, or more so. But what I want to get away from is this notion that you only improve in what you used in some way is somehow a tighter connection between player, character, and the events of play. Having observed so many years of playing the other way, I can assure you that that very same connection is extremely powerful, even when you get to choose. And there are those who would say, why should I be constrained at that level? I'm the one who's not thinking about my character in terms of what happened, like you are. I'm thinking about what the character is next time I play. That's my priority. And that's a fair cop. So there are different techniques to be, you know, to say I'm going by what happened in play and what I am and am not allowed to try to improve or improve. Or it doesn't matter what happened in play. I'm thinking about where I want this, what I want this character to look like next time I play. I've got the currency to do it, and I'm going to do it. We're good. It's all fine. They're all committed to play. And that's what matters, I think. So that's my take on that one. Finally, we move to arguably what could be the toughest for this month and probably the least conclusive. And it concerns, the joys of building a gaming library, you know, are manifest yet again. With this game from 1996, Maelstrom Storytelling by Christian Aldridge, and then swiftly followed by his game Story Engine. And Story Engine also was preceded by a very small book, or a short, as I recall, even staple-bound book called Story Bones, which is here in Story Engine as the first chapter. So that's Story Bones, which was also a separate product. So there's really three things. There's Maelstrom, the original game. There's Story Bones, which separate product and in the first part of Story Engine, and then Story Engine. So I actually had remembered that there were the three, but I'd kind of confounded the two in my mind besides Maelstrom. So I tended to think of Maelstrom as one thing, Storybone/Engine as another. Um, I find my notes in both, having played them all, and I find the notes in them. In Story Engine, the characters Gutta and Engleaf, both of which are anagrams of thought and feeling. So you can see I was being, a little twee and surreal, you know, with all this. But anyway, I found a lot of my notes about that. So that kind of helps me remember what it was like to play these things and why I have been, if not adamant, at least opinionated that I really do value Maelstrom quite a bit, particularly in contrast to its contemporaries of Theatrics and the simpler contemporaries of The Window and Rises, all of which were like storytelling games, and not bad, not story games, um, like those people. But anyway, I found Maelstrom to be really the only strong design of that bunch. And I also think that it is also the most good-hearted, the one that isn't picking on any other style of play, mode or set of techniques of play, I mean, and it isn't uh, purporting to save the world of role-playing. Um, and it's quite clear, it's beautifully written in many places about just what it means to focus on what I would say today, focus on fiction as the thing we're doing. Um, but yet it also is quite solid. I mean, it's dicey, it's points, and it is really quite pointed in it's got its you know how Over the Edge surprisingly is strong in system, particularly with its improvement mechanisms, its damage mechanisms, and things like that, which is one of the things I really like about Over the Edge. Hubris Games, the publisher, Christian, is clearly in that zone, right? So the idea, like Theatrics, of well, I guess if you're a fetishist, or you don't really know how to tell a story, I guess you could use dice. That's kind of the way that Theatrics puts it, and this is very different. No, these things punch into play for a reason. So all this is great, and I also am fairly confident about this because I sat down with Christian at length long ago, waving the game and saying, "Oh, can we talk about Maelstrom?" And we had a wonderful conversation. Really like Christian Aldridge. Haven't talked to him since, except for a couple of emails long ago. Wonder where he's at. Would love to hear from him, because I'm really feeling like playing some Maelstrom right now after this. Well, okay, to get to Gordon's question, why have I been opinionated that Maelstrom is all that and that Story Engine/Bones isn't? Okay, well, the review has helped me clarify my thinking, which I greatly appreciate the chance to do this. First of all, let's look at Maelstrom. It has a dedicated setting, and you'll probably groan a little bit because it's a very 90s setting. Yes, there's a setting. Oh, but it's broken and warped by, cosmic forces, and so its pieces shift position relative to one another, so the map is always changing. Okay, look, I'm the guy who did like barbaric psychedelic recently, with the D&D and things in the last decade with D&D 4e, so I'm no person to criticize the floaty, shifty, cosmically shattered realm of play, right? I get it. It's just very much one of those. So that's the setting. And realities bleed into one another. So you have these visitor characters who are obviously modern humans who are plopped there and are, looking around being player characters, as well as all the cool like native races and stuff, right, that you could be. There's a supplement too about the Empire, which I have. So the setting, surprisingly, you got to dive in and you got to start reading the pieces and stuff. And there's a little bit of the same sense you get with the Sphere Walker's Guide for Everway, where there's a little bit of like colorful tossing in stuff all over the place. some of which seems cool, some a little superficial. It's kind of up to you to decide. A lot of tropes that we're all familiar with. The various races are, you know, they're very 90s pop culture. So that's fine though. I'm not criticizing, but there's this dedicated setting and it's very much of its time. And it also is diddled with so that you can just play a dude from, you know, late 20th century Milwaukee who happens to find himself in the world. And that'll make it easy, apparently. So you've got this. What I want to focus on is this systemic relationship to the setting. And this is actually a sticking point in dialogue a lot of the time, a sticking point that how hard it is to say, okay, how should my system fit my setting? Wow, that's that's just going to spark everybody in their gamer pretty hard. So I'm kind of hesitant to drive into it in this point because I do think that in the system used in Maelstrom, the fact that you have to burn descriptors to get the dice for them or to do what are called quick takes, it's very much a scene resolution. What's the issue going on? Are we going to get through these guards or not? But it's marked by a common pools rolled against each other. And then you can exit yourself from that little pool prior to them being rolled, and say, hey, I'm not going to contribute to the pool. I'm going to go do this little thing, a quick take. You'll recognize this. It's Tunnels and Trolls. I mean, this is right out of Tunnels and Trolls, no question. It's just you have a resource for participation that gets used up, and it gets used up pretty harshly. You don't start with very many descriptors in this game. So so a big part of this is how resourcey this is. You have these descriptors and aspects and stuff like that, and they get used up, and it becomes important to not, burn them all out early in a session. And so you have to be fairly careful about what you get into, or if not careful, to decide how are you going to deal with this situation? How committed are you to it? Everybody has a base die or two that gets rolled in. We could all just stick with that and see how we do. Or we can put those descriptors into it and get this whole situation more rich in contributions, but recognize that we've got a finite capacity to do this. And the um, freewheeling nature of the setting of Maelstrom, which lends itself to odd little episodes or highly idiosyncratic situations, mixed of metaphysics and personalities and stuff, lends itself very well to saying, you know, things have changed and we are here instead of there, or this whole situation has changed in its confirmation. So everybody involved has a different opinion now, and we're starting a new session. And how are we going to deal with these resources in terms of navigating our way through the course of events as they proceed and resolve? um, Makes a lot of sense. In terms of whether that makes sense for any and everything, so that we have these, as the game says, the universal rules. I am very suspicious of this 90s fascination, which is actually second generation fascination with universal systems. GURPS promised us, and I can assure you that everybody publishing games in 1996 was just like me in 1986 when we bought GURPS and were told you'll never need another game. Oh, did we fall all over ourselves? And Rollmaster was, promising the same within, moments. Hero Games was promising the same, and this, the notion that why would I play D&D? I mean, that's so specialized. So, tunes to just playing D&D. Oh, good Lord, no. We need the universal role-playing system. We can play anything. oh, that was such a big deal. And I was surprised once I started getting involved in role playing publishing in the late 90s, right about the time the Story Engine is published, and when I put Sorcerer up for the first time in that same year. And I realized just how alive and kicking this concept was, which I had in the intervening times set aside. When I realized that I could play GURPS all I wanted to, and if I did anything with it, I wasn't be able to play anything. I was just able to play GURPS, always, with its own properties in action. And it was a complete reversal of the claim. So, customizable is one thing, necessarily customizable is another, which is, I think, very important. I mean, obviously, I have done a lot of games with that kind of approach. And then fixed, so that if you want to do it in some other setting, hack away, but no guarantees, man. I mean, there's who knows how this system is going to, throw a rod when you put it into some other situation without some thought, and probably, better off readjusting it as you go. Um, and whether, I mean, I think that when I look at Maelstrom, I find it quite easy to imagine playing. There's a game called Morpheus, which is really interesting in terms of points flowing into your character all the time and points flowing out of your character all the time, right in the moment to moment of play. And so Maelstrom is a little less frenetic than that, but it is has that same feeling of these things are coming in and these things are going out. I mean, I'm making descriptors with the points I get and I'm burning them. They'll recover for next session, but they get used. This is very resourcey, and very chancy, because these do turn into dice pool against dice pool, and there's a lot of potential for, burning your descriptor and fucking losing. So this is an issue. Consequence is big in Maelstrom, both in the setting and in the system, and it works nicely. So then you take a look and say, well, what about Story Bones, which came out? And Story Bones really focused on a much more, uh, I think, a much more, it tuned it to saying, well, okay, this person is like a role player, so we're going to write it in role playing language, and you're going to have skills, and you're going to, it basically looks like a kind of stripped down GURPS, which is what a lot of people thought was the ultimate game, Fudge being the primary example. And and although it still has things like the quick takes and stuff like that, it's got a very GURPSy build where you have your your lists of things that you can purchase to construct your character, and then those are very codified in terms of precisely what they do in the system, and it is a little more scene oriented than I recall, but it also has Storybones has a strong um, a strong what not the Maelstrom system, more like, use it for anything, and then you look at it and you're like, yeah, but so what? Why would I? It's just a character description and a resolution roll. I mean, I can do that with anything, and that isn't really very interesting. I mean, there's nothing to do with much about change. What are you hitting the environment with? What do you do to the environment? How does the environment change you? How is this involved in terms of points? And why am I suddenly, or does this resource burning technique actually apply to anything and everything? Because I don't think it does. So okay, so that's my issue with Story Bones, which is, I think, if not more than an opinion, much more than an opinion, it's got some justification perhaps underlying it. Story Engine, in my review now, turns out to be a lot more like Maelstrom than I recall. And having played it too, I mean, I'm looking at my notes now and going, oh yeah, so this is the one that did this. This one, you know what? I'm finding myself ambiguous about. That's why this is not a conclusive presentation about this. I'm saying, maybe playing a bunch of Maelstrom would be a whole lot of fun. Maybe taking Story Engine as itself quite seriously, which is pretty much the Maelstrom system, slightly clarified terminology, and genericized, but not genericized to anything, genericized to a particular punchy, high pressure kind of situation. Maybe so. Maybe so. Maybe I should be like, cranky about Story Bones and not make a big thing about Story Engine until I've revisited it. It would be perhaps well worth the time. All right. Thanks to everyone.